Welcome to the third and final part of a three-part lecture on the foundations of qualitative research 2. In this part we're going to focus on key concepts in qualitative research and particularly key theoretical and philosophical concepts. So this is where some of the tricky language and terminology comes in, but hopefully we'll help you to feel confident about your understanding of this material and demystify some of the more complex terminology. These materials are the result of a collaboration between Virginia or Ginny Braun on the left, myself, Victoria Clarke, in the middle, and Nikki Hayfield on the right. The lectures are either narrated by myself or by Nikki, and as you can tell, because I'm speaking, I will be narrating this three-part lecture. To give you an overview of this topic, this is the second of two lectures, each of which are divided into three parts, that explores the foundations of qualitative research, imaginatively titled Foundations of Qualitative Research 1 and Foundations 2. And in both of these sessions we'll be exploring the values, characteristics and theoretical and philosophical underpinnings of qualitative research. The aim of this second lecture is to provide further grounding in the foundations of qualitative research, building on the material covered in the first lecture. So if you haven't listened to the first lecture, you might like to go back and listen to that. We'll be introducing some of the concepts and terminology that define qualitative research. We'll be exploring some of the defining characteristics of qualitative research, and particularly how qualitative research and bigq qualitative research differs from quantitative research. This lecture also builds on the discussion of different orientations to qualitative research in the first lecture by considering the experiential and critical qualitative camps. And finally, this lecture explores key concepts such as subjectivity and reflexivity and the ontological and epistemological or philosophical foundations of qualitative research. Throughout the lectures, there are opportunities to pause the recording and reflect on your knowledge and understanding of qualitative research. Of the three parts of the lecture, in part 1 we explored the key characteristics of qualitative research. In part 2, experiential and critical approaches to qualitative research. And in this third and final part, this is where we get to some of the more challenging material. We're going to look at key concepts in qualitative research and particularly key theoretical and philosophical concepts. So you might find that you want to listen to this lecture a couple of times because it contains the most kind of difficult, challenging material. And I just want to emphasize that it is difficult, that it's normal to struggle with it. And so do be patient and kind to yourself if you're struggling to get your head around some of the material we discuss in this section, because everyone finds it complex. We find it complex. So yeah, just be kind to yourself. One of the really important key concepts in bigq qualitative research is subjectivity. That all research activity is seen as being influenced and shaped by various factors, and the influence of the researcher is part of that. Qualitative research, bigq qualitative research, is seen as an inherently subjective process. As researchers, we bring our own histories, values, assumptions, perspectives, politics, mannerisms, all kinds of things, our skills, our experiences, our training into the research process, so that we can't sort of leave these at the door. And so any knowledge produced will inevitably reflect these factors. So a bit of feedback that I often give my students is not a question of whether we've influenced the research, but rather how we've influenced the research. So do bear this in mind when it comes to writing your dissertation thesis and writing the reflexivity section, where you reflect on how you've shaped the knowledge that you've produced. It's not a case of seeing researcher influence as potential contamination, something we need to worry about. It's more a process of reflecting on how exactly we have shaped the understandings that have been produced. So here we have the Leaning Tower of Pisa to denote bias. The idea that researcher influence or researcher subjectivity is a potential threat to research, something that potentially disrupts the objectivity of research and that needs to be contained and controlled and managed in various ways. In bigq qualitative research, instead we think of subjectivity as a resource, something that is essential to the process of qualitative research, that we need our subjectivity to do it, that we need our subjectivity to collect data from participants, to interpret and make sense of data. So it's a real shift in how we think about subjectivity, particularly if you've been trained in a more scientific approach to doing research, where subjectivity is seen as a threat to objectivity and something that's inherently inferior to objectivity. In bigq qualitative research, as well as valuing researcher subjectivity, we also value participant subjectivity. So, for example, from an experiential or empathic perspective, this is a quote from Brendan Goff and Anna Medill, we treat the human subject as an expert on their experience and able to provide a transparent window onto their world through interview-based accounts. So this kind of captures the experiential take, that human beings are the experts, the authority on their experiences, and the knowledge that we produce through interviewing people is valid knowledge, meaningful knowledge. There's also a more social or suspicious take on subjectivity. So Goff and Medill talk about the individual as inextricably linked to other people and tied to sets of social, cultural and political contexts that influence and often constrain human action. So here we're seeing the human being in context and in relationship with others. Certainly there are some social perspectives that trouble the notion that people are transparent to themselves and can accurately report their own thoughts and feelings. So this we've seen is a kind of hallmark of a more experiential orientation, that we trust people to be authorities on their own experience. When we move to a more social, suspicious and critical orientation, then there can be some skepticism around the idea that people are transparent to themselves, that people are the authorities or experts on what they experience. From a constructionist perspective, subjective accounts are viewed as performing particular functions. So if we think back to the body art study in part 2, we can see that those accounts were analysed as performing particular actions, as negotiating identity in a particular way. And we'll explore a constructionist perspective a bit more later on in this part of the lecture. In acknowledging researcher subjectivity as integral to the practice of bigq qualitative research, we're also acknowledging the importance of reflexivity. Reflexivity is a rich, complex concept that can have slightly different meanings attached to it. Here we're understanding it as the way in which the researcher has a role in knowledge production. And the practice of reflexivity is the practice of critically reflecting on the content and the process of the knowledge we produce. So we have a reflexive statement in our dissertation or thesis to reflect on how we have shaped the knowledge we've produced. A really interesting discussion of reflexivity from feminist psychologist Sue Wilkinson from the 1980s, I think, is a really good place to start for thinking about reflexivity. And she makes a distinction between functional reflexivity and personal reflexivity. Probably what's more familiar to most of us is personal reflexivity, where we reflect on our role as researchers in shaping the research process, in shaping the knowledge we produce. Functional reflexivity is also important, and this is where we reflect on how our research tools and our design choices have shaped the research process. So how did the use of a focus group rather than an interview, for example, shape the knowledge produced? And both of these are important aspects of reflexivity. The other dimension of reflexivity that Wilkinson talks about is disciplinary reflexivity, where we reflect on how our disciplinary knowledge and training shapes how we go about doing research. And this can be really hard unless you work in an interdisciplinary environment, because you need other people outside of your discipline to kind of reflect back to you how you're thinking, like a psychologist or sociologist or whatever. So I really would recommend Sue Wilkinson's paper, even though it's focused specifically on feminist psychology, for helping you find a way into the concept of reflexivity and how you can bring it into your research process. This is a great quotation from US researcher Hess Biber that captures what reflexivity is and what reflexivity means. And she talks about reflexivity as beginning with understanding the importance of our own values and attitudes within the research process, and that we need to start this process before we start our research. So one thing I'd always recommend is that you keep a reflective or reflexive journal where you, throughout the research process, reflect on the choices you make, your emotional reactions to things, and how you think you're kind of shaping your knowledge. It will be a great resource when you come to writing up your dissertation or thesis. So she talks about reflexivity as meaning a critical look inward, a reflection on our own lived reality and experiences. So reflexivity is understood sometimes as the researcher kind of turning back on themselves. So she asks us some questions to consider. How does your own biography impact the research process? So here we might want to reflect on whether we're an insider researcher, a member of the group we're studying, or an outsider, and how that shapes our relationship to the topic and the participants. She also invites us to reflect on what shapes the questions you choose to study and your approach to studying them. So what brings you to a particular topic? How does the specific social, economic and political context in which you reside impact the research process at all levels? This is obviously a tough question and one that requires lots of reflecting, but this gives you a sense of what reflexivity is all about and the reflection that it requires of us as researchers in order to be effective in conducting our research, and understanding how we might be making assumptions that delimit how we engage with the research, how participants might respond to us in particular ways, and that shapes the research in various different ways. So, as I mentioned, I really encourage you to keep a reflexive journal and to start reflecting on the process of how you're shaping your research, what assumptions you're making, and use these kind of questions to reflect on: why am I interested in this topic? Why am I asking these kinds of questions? This kind of reflection will help you to enrich your research. So let's start with the stuff that gets everyone scratching their heads. Ontology and epistemology. Ontology is theories of reality or being, and epistemology is theories of knowledge, sometimes referred to as O&E stuff or the ologies. And what we have here is an ontology continuum that outlines some of the positions around the nature of reality that can underlie qualitative research. And it's important for researchers to be able to articulate their ontological and epistemological positions, because qualitative research isn't one thing, because there are different ways of doing qualitative research, even within an experiential framework or even within a critical framework. We need to have a sense of what our ontological and epistemological assumptions are and how these inform and shape our research. So on the ontology continuum, from my and Ginny's textbook, we have relativism at one end, realism at the other, and critical realism in the middle. Relativism is probably the most dominant ontological position in many disciplines, and this is based on the assumption that a reality exists separately from the process of doing research, separately from human practices, and we can access this reality through our research. At the other end of the continuum, we have relativism that views reality as entirely dependent on the ways that we come to know it. So here reality is entirely tangled up with our research, with our human practices, that we can't separate these things out. And then in the middle we have critical realism, which can be seen as having elements of both positions, that it assumes that there is a reality that exists, but that we can only ever come to know this partially. Okay, so that gives you a flavour of some of the different ontological positions. We'll look at these in a bit more detail on the next slide. White man with messy brown hair looking out a window. It's a nice clear pane of glass, so presumably he can see the world beyond the window fairly clearly, and he can also presumably get up from where he's sitting and go out and directly observe the world. This is a pretty good metaphor for realism. So let's think about ontological positions like realism in a bit more detail. Ontology is theories or philosophy about the nature of reality or being. I think onto, the origin of the word, is about being, but it's often discuss more in terms of theories of reality. As with anything in qualitative research, there's no one mapping of ontological positions. There aren't a set of ontological positions that all qualitative researchers agree on. This is our mapping of different ontological positions. So ontology determines whether or not we think reality exists separate from our human practices and understandings and the research that we conduct to find things out, or whether we think it cannot be separated from our human practices and research. So ontology specifies the relationship between the world and our human practices and interpretation. So realism assumes a knowable world, accessible through research. The truth, and there is only one truth, is out there and can be accessed. This is often talked about as a mind-independent theory of truth. So the realist is like the man looking through the window. There's a world out there. He can get up from the table and go out and directly access the world. Relativism posits that there are multiple constructed realities rather than a single reality or mind-independent truth, and that we can never get beyond these constructions. The internal world is both practically and theoretically inaccessible to us. Rather than being universal, what's real or true differs across time and context. So in relativism, reality is entirely dependent on human interpretation, on human knowledge. It's not separate from our human practices. Critical realism, as I said, sits somewhere between these two positions and is now very commonly adopted in qualitative research. It's probably the most commonly used ontological framework in qualitative research. It views knowledge as socially influenced, but knowledge reflects a separate reality that we can only partially access. So some notion of an authentic, separate reality is seen as important for producing knowledge that can make a difference. So where you sit on the realism-relativism continuum determines whether or not you think you can remove the process of knowledge production from what you're studying, or whether you can remove it. So you can't remove it, relativism, you can remove it, realism. So epistemological frameworks capture what counts as real or valid knowledge and how we go about producing that knowledge. So epistemology are theories or philosophies of knowledge and knowledge production. As with ontology, there's no one mapping of epistemological positions that all qualitative researchers would agree on. This is our particular mapping. Some understand ontological positions as giving rise to particular epistemological positions. So we can think of O&E stuff as like a layer cake with ontology at the bottom, giving rise to particular epistemological positions on top of that, and then epistemological positions give rise to particular methodological positions, and then this gives rise to particular kind of orientations to research questions, methods, and so on. So there are three main epistemological positions, and these broadly map on to the ontological positions that we've just discussed. Firstly, post-positivism or positivism, which maps onto realism. Contextualism, which maps onto critical realism and is broadly similar to approaches like standpoint theory, phenomenology, and constructivism, and the ivism is really important here. And then constructionism, which broadly maps onto relativism, but also can be underpinned by critical realism and frameworks like post-structuralism and postmodernism. So a question we have to ask ourselves here is reality, external reality and personal reality, discovered through the process of research, or is it created through the process of research? So we need to reflect on whether we see ourselves as researchers, as artists, as creating knowledge, or whether we're archaeologists, we're discovering or finding knowledge, like the dog digging in the sand. So let's talk about these three positions in a bit more detail. Positivism and post-positivism assume a relatively straightforward relationship between the world and our perception of it. Positivism separates out the practice of observation, the observer, and that which is observed, and requires demonstration of reality through objective, unbiased collection of data. So valid knowledge is obtained through the application of traditional scientific methods which control variables and remove various forms of contamination and bias. Appropriate application of these methods will discover the truth that is out there. In many disciplines, it would be hard to find an unreconstructive positivist. Instead, post-positivism tends to dominate. This version still holds on to the search for truth and sees truth and objective knowledge as to some extent achievable, but acknowledges that researchers are influenced by their context and researchers influence research. Facts are not neutral reflections of truth, but are theoretically influenced. Where this framework differs from constructionism is that it still believes in and aims to know that singular truth, and thus seeks to remove or control for subjective influences of knowledge production as much as possible. Qualitative research can be conducted in this paradigm, but it tends to be small q qualitative. Big Q qualitative tends to be either contextualist or constructionist. So contextualism can be understood as having a foot in both positivist and constructionist camps, and it's sometimes seen as a version of constructionism light, in that it doesn't assume a single reality and views knowledge as emerging from context, so that knowledge is always local, situational and provisional, but it does retain an interest in understanding truth and hence has a realist dimension. While no single method can get to the truth, it argues that some knowledge will be valid or true in certain contexts. The central metaphor of contextualism is the human act in context. Constructionism questions the idea that knowledge is an objective, or objective as possible if you're a post-positivist, reflection of reality, but instead sees our way of knowing the world as tied to the social world in which we live. And we're going to discuss constructionism in a bit more detail because it's one of the most sort of counterintuitive frameworks for thinking about the epistemological foundations of qualitative research. Before unpacking constructionism in a bit more detail, let's focus a bit more on contextualism, as it's such an important framework for big Q qualitative research. So contextualism emphasizes the ambiguous, context-contingent nature of language and meaning, and the dependence of data on theory and interpretation. So data don't straightforwardly speak for themselves, or don't straightforwardly represent reality. Data only make sense or have meaning through the lens of theory and through the researcher's interpretive practices. So in a contextualist framework, we need a researcher, a subjective positioned researcher, to make sense of data. That meaning isn't fixed in data, that the meaning of data becomes apparent through the researcher's interpretive practices. So one of the central metaphors of contextualism is the idea of the person in context, that we can't study human beings divorced from and in isolation from the context that render their lives meaningful. In order to understand human beings, we need to understand the context in which they live. What this all means is that knowledge produced through research is local, situated and provisional. And researcher reflexivity can help render visible some of the context for knowledge production. So this is one of the reasons why reflexivity is important, is that we can share with readers some of the context that have shaped the research and that have shaped the knowledge produced. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a flavour of a contextualist framework for big Q qualitative research. And this captures lots of different approaches to qualitative research. So we can view approaches like phenomenology, critical realism, and so on as broadly contextualist, broadly sitting in this kind of middle position between positivism and constructionism. So let's look at constructionism, probably the most tricky because it's the most counterintuitive epistemological framework, in a bit more detail. Unlike approaches like critical realism or realism that kind of reflect common sense understandings of the world to some extent, constructionism is very counterintuitive, which I think is why it's quite difficult. So from a constructionist position, the world and what we know of it don't reflect an objective, true nature of the world waiting to be discovered. What we know of the world, both the world out there and the world inside our heads, is constructed and produced through various systems of meaning, what is often referred to as discourses, and that we all reside and operate within these systems of meaning. And as these systems of meaning change, truth changes. So there's no one truth that a certain method would allow access to. There are knowledges rather than knowledge, truths rather than truths, realities rather than reality. So the terms in which our world is understood are seen to be related to specific social and cultural contexts. Knowledges are viewed as social artifacts. They're social, political, cultural and moral. So constructionist framework tend to take a critical or skeptical stance on perceived truth and taken for granted knowledge. However, constructionism isn't saying that knowledge is just made up and anything goes, nor that there's nothing outside the text. There's no kind of material reality. And this quotation from US Professor of Art History and AIDS activist Douglas Crimp is a really useful way, I think, of thinking about the relationship between social constructionism and things like reality, biology and the material world. So Crimp says that AIDS does not exist apart from the practices that conceptualize it, represent it and respond to it. We know AIDS only in and through these practices. So what he's saying here is that our human ways of understanding and relating to and making sense of AIDS shape how we experience it, and we can't sort of push these aside to get to some absolute universal reality of AIDS. So he's making really clear that this isn't saying that AIDS isn't real. So this assertion does not contest the existence of viruses, antibodies and so on. Least of all does it contest the reality of illness, suffering and death. What it does contest is the notion that there's an underlying reality of AIDS upon which are constructed the representations, the culture, the politics of AIDS. If we recognise that AIDS exists only in and through these constructions, then hopefully we can recognise the imperative to know them, analyse them and wrest control of them. So this is where constructionism becomes really hopeful. That if we understand something like AIDS is a product of human culture and human practice, then we can challenge dominant understandings and produce better, more just, more resistive understandings of AIDS. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the constructionist position, that it's not saying that things aren't real, that we don't experience things as real, that it's not saying there isn't a material world, that there isn't biology, but rather we only experience things through the lens of our own human practices and human understandings, that we can't kind of push these aside in any meaningful sense to get at the underlying truth or reality. For most of you, you won't be doing constructionist research. It's a relatively kind of minority pursuit. So what I want to just highlight is that constructionism exists as a possibility, that it's a dimension of bigq qualitative research, and you just need to have a sense that there are other possibilities beyond what you're doing in your own research. Obviously, if you're going to do constructionist research, then you really need to get to know it incredibly well, and we've given you some suggestions for readings to get you started on that journey. But don't worry too much if you don't understand all the ins and outs of constructionism. It's just holding on to the idea that there are multiple possibilities for qualitative research. So I really want to emphasize here that theory and philosophy aren't only abstract concerns, because they're quite difficult and challenging. It can feel like they're things that we need to kind of sit around thinking about and worrying about. But it's important to hold on to the fact that theory is something that we do, something that we practice, that qualitative research can never be atheoretical. Some researchers might claim their research is atheoretical, but we're always making assumptions as researchers, even if we aren't aware of it, about the nature of reality, what constitutes meaningful knowledge. Even inductive or theory generating orientations are not atheoretical. They're still underpinned by ontological and epistemological assumptions. So it's important to see theory as something that we practice through the doing of our research, rather than sort of abstract concerns that sit behind it. When we approach our data and interpret it in particular ways, we're enacting our theoretical assumption. So a useful question to reflect on is, what kind of truth am I interested in hearing? What formulation of truth am I drawn to as a researcher? So building on that idea of theory as a practice, let's compare some of the different ways in which a positivist qualitative researcher, or a small q qualitative researcher, and a big Q qualitative researcher would engage in the research process. And this is drawing on the work of Carter and Little. So a positivist qualitative researcher would use the language and the concept of science to design their research. This would inform how they collect the data, how they analyse their results, and how they ensure and judge the quality of their research. Whereas big Q qualitative is located within a distinctly qualitative tradition of knowledge generation, quality control, and research reporting. So it has a very different set of research values. In positivist qualitative research, the goal of the researcher is to understand reality in a way that's as accurate as possible. The ideal, of course, is replication, that another researcher should be able to replicate the results in the same or a similar setting. In big Q qualitative, the researcher's goal is to understand meaning and context. They should allow the unexpected to happen and be open to multiple ways of observing how people use language to create meaning. So they aren't concerned with an objective reality, a replicable reality. Instead, they're focused on meaning in a particular context. Continuing this comparison, in positivist qualitative research, objectivity is worth striving for. The assumption is that it's possible to access participants' real thoughts and feelings, but we need to be alert for things like deception, inconsistency, and error. In big Q qualitative, knowledge is understood to be the product of particular relationships and interactions. So it's the product of a researcher interacting with a participant in an interview, for example, and so is context bound. Another researcher or another setting or group of participants will create different knowledge. There might be some commonalities, there might be many commonalities, but there would also be differences. So meaning is understood as being created differently in different times and contexts, and the researcher should explore the context for these differences. In terms of data collection and relating to participants, the researcher in small q qualitative, in positivist qualitative, should avoid introducing bias and inaccuracy into data collection by approaching it in a non-leading, unobtrusive and depersonalized way. Whereas in big Q qualitative, the researcher is understood as co-creating meaning with participants. They're not sort of extracting meaning from participants. They're an active producer of the research. And so the researcher should be themselves when interacting with participants and work to establish trust and rapport. So the different understandings of how the researcher should relate to participants. Continuing on the comparison, if we think about the purpose of researcher reflection, in small q qualitative, the researcher should set aside their assumptions and prior knowledge to avoid these influencing or contaminating the research. Whereas in big Q qualitative, the researcher should constantly reflect on their role in the process of creating knowledge and ideally keep a research journal, sometimes called a reflective journal or a reflexive journal, to record their reactions and experiences and so on. In small q qualitative, the participant is viewed as under investigation. They're relatively passive in the research process, and the aim of the research is to report their thoughts and their feelings accurately, to get inside their heads, to walk a mile in their shoes. In big Q qualitative, participants are understood as active and co-creators of meaning. And the researcher's interpretive resources always shape how they interpret the participants' account. So there's no sort of direct access to how participants are making sense of things. In small q qualitative, in positivist qualitative, accuracy and reliability of observations and interpretations are prioritised. Whereas in bigq qualitative, how quality is conceptualized is open to debate, but generally criteria specific to the qualitative tradition are prioritized to judge quality and to ensure quality. So Yardley, for example, talks about depth of engagement, kind of spending time with your data, spending time interpreting your data, and sensitivity to context. So we've talked about how important understanding the context of meaning and sense making and the context of participants is, and so good qualitative bigq research shows sensitivity to context. So if we think about the steps the researcher can take to ensure the quality of their research, in small q qualitative, to increase accuracy, the researcher will use multiple coders, multiple observers. They'll ask participants to check their transcripts for errors. They might triangulate data sources by using different kinds of data sources or different methods. The data analysis will begin after data collection is completed. There'll be a code book. Coders will be trained to code the data using the code book, and there'll be statistical tests used to determine the level of agreement between coders, and themes will be agreed through consensus, and the participants might be asked if they agree with the results. So in all these practices we can see the idea that there's a truth within the data, or the potential for an accurate interpretation of the data if the correct methods are employed. Whereas in bigq qualitative, it's all about reflexivity, and it's all about the researcher kind of reflecting on their assumptions and so on. And a good analysis is seen to come from things like depth of engagement. In terms of reporting practices, in small q qualitative, we tend to see reports written in the objective scientific third person using the language of science, whereas in bigq qualitative, there is a recognition and a move to embrace distinct reporting styles. Ideally, the researcher writes with their own voice and tells their story. There's a recognition of the role of the researcher in crafting the story of the research. So there's more sort of first person writing in bigq qualitative reports. So these comparisons kind of give you a flavour of the differences between positivist and bigq qualitative, and how those epistemological and ontological positions shape our research practice and how they're evident in our research practice. So we can look at a paper, and researchers might not state what their ontological and epistemological positions are, but we can look at what they've done, and from what they've done, read back their ontological and epistemological assumptions. So one of the key takeaways from this lecture is that qualitative research isn't one thing. There are differences in ontological and epistemological assumptions. There are theoretical and methodological differences. Qualitative research can be small q or bigq, and we're concentrating on bigq in most of this teaching. Qualitative research, bigq qualitative research, can be experiential or critical, and this means there are no universal standards for the quality of qualitative research. Small q researchers might value the same things that quantitative researchers do, while bigq researchers value quality standards and practices that reflect the assumptions and values of a qualitative paradigm. So another key takeaway is that doing bigq qualitative research well involves developing a qualitative sensibility. We can almost think of this as a kind of qualitative headspace, a way of thinking about qualitative research. And some of the features of a qualitative sensibility we think are things like having an interest in process and meaning. So rather than cause and effect and relationships between variables, you're more interested in social processes and meaning making. That you have a critical and questioning approach to life and knowledge. That you don't take things at face value and simply accept the way things are, but you ask questions about why are things this way rather than that way, whose interests are served by this, and how could things be different. You also need the ability to step out of your cultural membership to become a cultural commentator. So we're all members of particular cultures, but in order to effectively study that culture, we need to be able to step back. to see and question the shared values and assumptions that make up being a member of a particular society. And this is partly about identifying our own assumptions and then putting them aside, what's often known in phenomenology as bracketing, so that our research isn't automatically shaped by these. Obviously this is aspirational and it's never fully complete and it's difficult to do, but it's important to be able to kind of reflect on our assumptions to get deep into qualitative data. It's also important to develop a double consciousness, that when we're listening to or reading data, that we can both listen intently to the words, to the meaning, but also reflect critically on what's being said. And this can be used when we're analysing our data, but it can also be used when we're collecting data. So if we have a good double consciousness when we're doing an interview, we're both able to kind of be present with the participant, to focus on the content of what we're saying, but also spot particularly kind of interesting avenues, avenues for analysis, and that we can follow up and prompt and ask for more detail. So this helps us produce kind of better, richer data. Reflexivity is also really important, the capacity to critically reflect on the research process and our own role as researcher, including our various insider and outsider positions. We also need to have good interactional skills, a warm and friendly manner that puts people at ease and helps establish rapport and trust. This doesn't mean you have to be an extrovert or outgoing. I'm certainly not. I would define myself as an extreme introvert, but still I manage to do qualitative interviews because I understand that I'm a researcher, I'm performing a role, but you still need to be able to deploy some kind of human skills of warmth and so on. You also need a basic grasp of some methods, but to some extent you can learn on the job. You don't need to know everything about qualitative research to get going. And you also need a basic conceptual understanding of qualitative approaches. What we've covered in this lecture is more than enough to get you started. So this just gives you a sense of some of the skills you need to develop your qualitative sensibility. This has been a bumper lecture, so feel free to stop here, but we wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of consolidate everything that we've talked about and kind of check your understanding and knowledge of the material covered in the lecture. So what we'd like to invite you to do is have a read of the Short and colleagues paper on Blackboard, exploring the role of music therapy in cardiac rehabilitation after cardiothoracic surgery, and then answer the questions that we have here on the slide. So we'd like you to reflect on whether you think the research is an example of small q or big Q qualitative research and why that is. And it might also be that it's confused Q, so it has elements of both. We'd like you to reflect on whether this study is an example of experiential or critical qualitative research and why you think that is. What do you think the researcher's understanding of language is? Do they view language as reflective, intentional, performative, or constructionist? Do you have a sense of what the researcher's epistemological and ontological assumptions are? Do they state these in the paper, or can you look at other information given in the paper and try and detect what these are? And if they do state them, do they sort of enact them consistently, or is there some confusion and inconsistency in the paper? How do you think participant subjectivity is treated in the paper? How is researcher subjectivity treated? And can you identify any evidence of researcher reflexivity in this paper? So we'll give you our reflections on the next couple of slides. So if you'd like to engage in this activity, pause the recording now, read the paper, and then come back to these questions. So these are our reflections on the Short and colleagues paper. Just want to emphasize these aren't the sort of reveal of the correct answers. These aren't the definitive take. These are just our interpretation of how we understand the paper. So in relation to whether this is an example of small q or big Q, we think it's broadly big Q, but there's certainly some valuing of participant subjectivity, and there's no sort of positivism creep. We express some kind of uncertainty about that because we're not 100%, but it does seem to be broadly big Q. In terms of whether it's experiential or critical, we think it's very much experiential qualitative research, and this is reinforced by the researchers more reflective or intentional view of language, that what participants say is treated as a transparent reflection of their feelings, that the data extracts are presented as illustrative of participants' thoughts and experience. So it's very much in that reflective or intentional kind of view of language. In terms of the researcher's ontological and epistemological assumptions, not uncommonly for much published qualitative research, these aren't explicitly stated, but having read the paper, we think possibly some kind of realism, maybe critical realism and contextualism, focusing on the person in context. There's an inductive analysis of the data, and they're seeking to produce an account of participants' experiences that's recognisable to participants. So this is kind of leaning us more towards realism because of the emphasis on member checking. Continuing our reflections on the Short and colleagues paper, in terms of how participants' subjectivity is treated in the paper, participants' subjective experiences of treatment and recovery are treated as valid, meaningful knowledge. The researchers talk about an emic perspective, so looking at things from the viewpoint of participants. In terms of how researcher subjectivity is treated, researcher subjectivity is treated as a resource rather than a problem to be managed. The primary researcher analysed the data, wrote a reflective commentary on the data and analysis, and discussed the analysis with the co-researchers, but there was no consensus coding or anything like that. Can you identify any evidence of researcher reflexivity in this paper? The final question 7, no, it wasn't mentioned. It doesn't mean that the paper doesn't have some reflexive dimensions in terms of the acknowledgement of researcher subjectivity, but there's no explicit discussion of researcher reflexivity in this paper. Here is the first slide of references for this part of the lecture. Here is the second and final slide of references. Just to reiterate, we've covered some really difficult stuff in this lecture, so give yourself time to get your head around it. You may want to listen to the lecture again, you may want to do some further reading.